Da 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 do 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 do. Do 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 do. Oh, good lord! It's always so blooming difficult to log into this. That's working! Yay! That's working. Oh god, that's not working. Why is that not working? Okay, reset that. Do that. Ah, now it's working. Yay! It's working. Hey, caramba. Okay. Oh, that one. Oh, wonderful. Yay! Made it. Okay, is that working? Is that working? Oh, good lord, buffer. Buffer, work for me. Work for me. Please, work for me. Well, that'll do. That'll do, buffer. You and I will have long conversations later trying to get this all working out. But for a first time, that will do, buffer. That will do. I know. You're trying very hard. Note to self, respond to command sound mother. Good lord, the note to responding people's list is getting massive at the moment. I will get round to it. Anyway, everything's to be live. They appear to be working. That's even better. Hello, everyone. By my count, today is the 22nd of January, and this is Churchill doesn't implement the World War II pause in construction. And, well, hello. How are we all doing? Let me put it this way. It's been a day, and tonight there's going to be more fun. There's supposed to be a storm, and what does it say about your day when your sister brings a whole bottle of this and tells you you're going to need it, okay? You know. Also, there are various new computer systems I'm learning how to use. I spent last week meeting with various people from ShipShape and other things and working out what systems I should be using and trying to upgrade software game and experimenting and playing stuff. Basically, I listen to Gareth quite a lot, Gareth the Brit, who does a lot of very cool stuff. I listen to Gareth quite a lot, Gareth the Brit, and has a lot of good ideas, and so I'm trying some of the things he suggested to me, and I'm going to be setting up a website soon, and I'm going to setting up things as soon as I can provide a link to my PhD thesis. I'm going to have that all set up and that all sorted, and then yeah, it'll be fun. Right then, there's an ad. Okay, let me check the settings for the ads, because the ad buttons are certainly not supposed to be doing as much as they're doing, if they're doing that. Yeah. Let's have a conversation with the settings. The stream settings and the thing, because the ads are supposed to be every 30 minutes for individual viewers. He says. Monetization is on. The ad system is set up. It's supposed to be every 30 minutes. So if it gets more often than that, tell me and I will have an argument with it. And I do have arguments with these things. Am I going to add? No, I'm literally going to link to where the feast is going to be hopefully displayed by King's College London. And just go, there it is. For all those people keep saying I don't actually have my pieces, I do. Just been under rules for years. Princess August, this bottle was given to me by my sister. Do not use the R word in connection with it. Please do not. That is just, no. No, I love her dearly, but very much as a sister. No. Just no. It causes us both to have absolute brain aneurysms. Right. So today's topic is rather a fun one, really. It's what happens if Churchill doesn't come in and go, in World War I we paused construction because you weren't building escorts, so I'm going to pause construction. And it takes 3 months for him to realise they had already been building the escorts, and here's the thing. If anyone wants a fun thing, go and look at Harlan and Wolff. And go and look at the list of Flower-class corvettes which were built and who they were built by. And also, if you want to, go and look at the Hunt-class destroyer and who they were built by. And one of the interesting things you'll find is the vast majority of the ones which are built by the major yards were started long before the pause came in. The example I'll give is if you talk about the first batch Type 1 of the Hunt-class escort destroyer, I don't think there is a single one of those which was not laid down before August 22nd. Latest that all laid down was the 22nd of August 1939. Actually, no, I tell a lie. Cottesmore and Cotswold were laid down later, as was Hambledon. They were laid down in December 1939 and December 1939, etc. They were all ordered, though, in March 1939. They ordered 21 in March 39, and actually, and 10. They ordered 10 in March 39 and 10 April 39. 3 more ordered in September, but they're all ordered well before war begins. I think even the Type 2s, the World War II begins starts on the 1st September 1939, and they order the 18 Type 2s on the 4th of September 1939, and I think that's even before Churchill gets into power, before he gets even called back, realistically, and is actually able to do the pauses, so certainly before he does the pause. So, the Hunt-class escort destroyers, the Flower-class corvettes, all of them are ordered. Very few of them are going to use the big space in the big yards. Even if those which are built in the big yards, and mostly the Hunt-class destroyers are built in bigger yards, they're not using their main slips. They're not using the space they use for battleships and carriers and cruisers. They're not even using the spaces they use for destroyers, realistically. They're using the places they use for smaller ships and some of the merchant shipping they build. They are not using them using those same facilities. Some of them are even sticking them shamelessly in sub-yards and spare yards, which they have. Some of them are just renting yards nearby, which have closed down. It's just absurd. Princess Zoe, didn't really mean it that way, but realised it afterwards. Yes, I thought it would. Oh. No. Anyway, with that being said, let's start off by looking at the history, because this is all turn history. Let's look at the actual history. So let's consider what happens with cruisers. And usually I get asked, well, how can you prove that this pause really delays things? Our refuser class takes on average 851 days to build. Town class cruisers take a build date average of 900 days to build, and of those, 6 out of 10 took a lot less than 900 days and were an average of 863 days to build. The Crown Colony class are supposed to take an average of 1,080 days. The Crown Colonies, remember, are stripped down for war emergency construction towns, which have been simplified to make them easier to construct so you can construct them more quickly. This is demonstrated by the fact that Fiji herself takes 767 days to build. The Fiji subclass has an average build time of 988 days. That's 88 more than the average for the total town class cruisers, and you can guess which 6 are actually quicker. They're the ones which are closer in size to the Crown Colonies. It's over 25 days longer than the towns, which are smaller. The Ceylon subclass take an average of 1,323 days to build. 1,323 days. In pre-war time, that's enough to build your average town class cruiser and be more than halfway through building its successor on the slips. Think about that. This is wartime. They're supposed to be reducing the build. But it gets even better, because let's introduce you to the Didos, built on the same hull as the Arafusers. Didos. Well, Didos take an average of 1,207 days. The Dido subclass, 1,120 days. The Bellona subclass, 1,397 days. Now, one of the reasons why the subclasses, etc., and classes further down are caused to be a problem is because what happens. See, what happens, they pause the construction. It's not really a problem with the people joining up. That doesn't cause as much an issue because shipyard workers are a bit of a protected profession. And there are protections around them, and it is trying to sort those things out. And what they work on from that is, to be honest, what they work on from that is developing the process. The trouble is, first of all, they try and go with the shipyard, okay, we're going to have more control. We're going to start moving workers around. We're going to move workers to the yards, because once he says pause construction and focus on the ships, the escorts, Churchill thinks that means they're going to down tools in those yards and then build the escorts in those yards. But the escorts are already under production in other yards and other spaces. So what they instead do, because it's more sensible in that situation, and doesn't involve you moving a load of ships and hulls around, which otherwise could distress and have problems, you leave them in space and you move the personnel. But one of the problems is there's quite a lot of skill sets which you don't need on the smaller ships you have on the big ships. For example, think about how many people you need who are used to working with armor plates on the small ships. Think about that. How many of those people who work with heavy-duty armor are going to be needed on the small ships? And also, here's the other thing to think about. A lot of those people who work with those armor skills, because of the gap in skills, because of the gap in construction, because of the treaties and the pause in construction of capital ships, a lot of those skills have atrophied a bit anyway. So actually, you are pausing these people just in the point at which they are learning, once again, how to use their capabilities, how to use their skills. This is Many, many levels of silly. Many, many levels of silly. And that's a problem. You see, for the cruisers and Churchill's pause, basically, the dates alone read the story. They tell us, well, hang on, these ships, if we consider the pause goes on for about 6 months. So realistically, the difference between the Crown Colony class is average and the Town class is average is 180 days. That's roughly 6 months. So that is entirely the pause, you can say. But think about the didos. Think about the didos. Think about the salons, and some of these ships. That's massive. That's because of the cumulative impact of the pause. You see, the pause causes dropping people. People are just developing their skills, and then it tapers off again. They also have the fact that when they come back, they're having to implement changes which have been created by the war. Instead of you building a new class of cruiser to deal with the new lessons, you're trying to change the ships you're already building, because that's quicker, but it's going to add time onto their build times. It's going to delay them getting into service. You're also going to deal with a hull which might have been damaged by exposure to the weather, because ship hulls are not designed to be sitting on dry land unsupported by water. There is actually a max amount of time which you want them on dry land before you put them in the water. You do not want them on the dry land for a long, long time. And then you've got the degradation of skills again. And you got the damage done by bombing and other operations. Basically, the whole thing just adds up to a load of mess. And the really worst thing about all this is because it's a pause of construction, and then it's a restart of construction. They first focus on the ships they can most quickly get ready, so they chuck everything into those. So those get ready more quickly than they would probably, on average, the others, which is why the ones which are further down the list, especially the secondary subclasses, this is why the Ballonas and the Salons take so long, don't get left for longer than 6 months. And this all creates issues. At certain points in World War II, in the run-up to 1914, especially in 1942-43, but also in 1941, you will hear Britain talk about a capital ship and a carrier shortage. You will see it in books, and authors will talk about how there is a shortage of X, Y, and Z ships, that Britain doesn't have enough carriers to go around. I will even tell you, Britain doesn't have enough carriers. Britain doesn't have enough cruisers. Britain doesn't have enough fast capital ships. They don't necessarily have enough fast capital ships, so Hood can't go in for a refit. All sorts of things happen. And all of it is down to this. Quite literally. It is down to this. And it gets worse when you start to consider things like the King George V's. When you start to work with this kind of class, because this class really is fun when we start to consider these details. Okay? When we start to consider the details of this class, that's when you really go, oh my. What happened? Why did this happen? Which fool made this happen? Because the King George V herself took 1,369 days to build. The average for the first three was 1,472 days, And the class overall was 1,597 days. Now the thing is, 6-month build time is most easily eaten up by something like this particular class. A battleship is a longer build, so it tends to be able to absorb in its construction the time cost of this build more. But again, once you start working things out, let's say you do get disruption from building, etc. Let's say we give an average of 1,400 days to build. You get King George, you get Prince of Wales and Duke of York coming in 3 and 6 months earlier than they originally did. If Anson and Howe keep the 1,400 days, then you get them in service roughly a year earlier. In simple terms, if we consider the timeline for the Battle of Denmark Strait, when we have Prince of Wales just out of the yard, still with issues being corrected because she hasn't had time to properly work up, and she's got Hood with her because there aren't enough ships to go round. Well, there would have been not just Duke of York in service, not just Prince of Wales entering service in November 1940. Duke of York would have entered service in February 1941, Anson in May 1941, and Howe in April 1941. So the only one which would miss Denmark Straits is Anson. Imagine that! In that scenario, do we think Hood is going anywhere near the Battle of Denmark Straits? Yeah, that's if Denmark Straits even happens in this scenario, because all sorts of things change. All sorts of things become changes and have a fun time. This is the reality we're talking about. And I'm not actually sure. King George V, including her delay, took 1,369 days, and even she got a delay in her build. We take this down. Well, once you go through these ships, you've got an entirely different scenario. Because the Royal Navy rolls into 1941. It's a case of, well, yeah, we had lost Royal Sovereign. That was annoying. We lost an R-class battleship. But, yeah, we've now got we've got now 4 King George V's in service. 2 joined in 1940. 2 have joined in 1941, and a 5th one's coming in 1941. That would have changed the scenario. And this is the point. I'm not even talking about the classes which are just literally laid down. If you pause a line, it's barely started construction, okay? You don't have to keep that going. In fact, possibly it's almost sensible not to. But pausing the King George V is stupid, because they are far enough along construction, they will actually be in service. This is not going to be a quick war. And the thing is, as we'll talk about later, Ola Greg, if Bismarck sallies with a sister ship, that's going to be even later, because Tirpitz is on a later deadline than she is, and that means even more's available. And this is the factor you have to start thinking at this point is, okay, so if we have these in service, how does that change our timeline? Because you don't just have these in service. You potentially have cruisers. All these are getting delayed. You know, think about that. Think about these ships. Think about the time it takes them. The class average overall is 1,597 days. It takes Howe 1,842 days. 1,842 days. Now, if anyone wants to do the maths and divide 1,842 by 365, you're more than welcome to do it, but this is the point. When King George V takes 1,369 days. In simple terms, Howe takes 473 days more to build than King George V. 473. $5.505 years. Thank you, Duffmeister. Yes. That's absurd! Almost. She's still useful, but this is the point, mate. People can go, battleships useful or not useful, but having that ship hanging around in a yard for 5 years instead of finishing off, that is not useful. It has an impact all across. It will have an impact all across, but again, that's something we'll be talking about later, because we're talking about history in this part. It's pre the Shameless Book Plug, so we're talking about history. So, Smidden, I love your question. Please put it in the system, and we'll get to it later. We will get it to it later, but make sure it's in the system so it's got to it later. Because they've got the illustrious class. Class average build time was 1,320 days. It took 1,124 days to build HMS Illustrious. Formidable took 1,256 days. Victorious and Indomitable, we're talking well over 1,400 days. Just putting it down to an average build time of 1,200 days, which would not be would be about normal for a carrier and what you'd expect. And these, I'm talking peacetime building times, right? This is not extra shifts. This is not, we are going to push these ships through and get them out into service as quickly as possible. This is just leaving it at the regular standard shifts. You would have Formidable in service by September 1940, Victorious in August 1940, and Indomitable in February 1941. Now that could have a really interesting effect on the Battle Atlantic or the Battle of the Mediterranean or even the Far East. Because that could mean you could quite easily have 2 or even 3 illustrious class taking part in Taranto. And that's going to have an effect on what you need at Trafalgar, you need in the Mediterranean to deal with the Regia Marina. 1 carrier, 1 HMS Illustrious alone does X amount of damage. Imagine what 3 of her does. And we talked about the Battle of Denmark Strait, but again, one of the problems is you have Victorious's air group are barely worked up. One of the reasons they're barely worked up is Victorious hasn't entered service that long. Well, in this case, she's in service in August 1940. By the time the Battle of Denmark Strait comes round, that air group will be a frigging veterans. Someone help Smidden out. They've done a Q6A. I've just seen it, and yeah. I didn't put it in. Timu just said that in the Powder Monkey. And the point is, This is not straining Britain. This is not pushing on with the implacables. This is not pushing on anything. This is just completing the ships which are already quite far along, which we already have the power plants for, which we already have most of the industrial material for sitting on the sides. Quite literally, in the case of 3 of these class, their entire capabilities to build them sit on the blooming dockside, waiting to be built into them because they've moved the people on and off them, constructing it. Quite literally, the catapults, the armour, some of the flight deck steel, some of a lot of the communications gear sits in a warehouse on the dockside waiting to be put aboard the carrier because they pulled the people off. And it gets damaged. One of the reasons why Victorious takes so long to build is the stuff which is being put in her has been damaged sitting in a dockside warehouse literally 300 yards from the ship. No worries, man. You're not as numpty as a decision. So, the thing is, I can understand the logic. If you think you're going to be fighting a submarine war again, then there is a reason to do what they've done. But here is one of the biggest jokes of all of it. In 1940, at the point at which the Germans war was starting and Churchill was making a decision, already a whole load of Hunt class and Flag class had been ordered. I'm talking roughly 100 of the things. And B, and are on the path to construction. B, the Germans have roughly 40 submarines operational. Coastal, oceanic, the lot. As we've talked about before on this channel, if the British had been successful in destroying submarines, as they were destroyers in the Battle of Norway in April 1940, the British would have crippled the German U-boat force because all those crews are the critical crews which provide a nucleus for expansion. All the senior officers and senior NCOs that later are critical to the expanded massive U-boat force of 1941, 42, 43. If you kill them off in Norway 1940, it doesn't happen. And one of the reasons why they're not killed off is because their torpedoes are so ineffective at that point, the British don't realise there's actually German submarines deployed there in some of the places. They actually believe the Germans deployed a very light or only a smattering of their submarines to Norway. They thought they were keeping them concentrated on defending the mouth of the Baltic. And yes, Chandler, you have remembered correctly. Here is the other fun thing. British ASW doctrine, as I've talked about on many times in this channel, requires carriers. Carriers are the cornerstone of the ASW hunting groups with their aircraft, and the out-of-defense of task groups against submarines with their aircraft. So carriers are cornerstones to British ASW construction and operation. It's insane. It really is absolutely toddling insane. So far we've done carriers, we've done King George V, we've done the Paws, we've done the cruisers, we've done the reason why for it. But you see, the thing is, I talk about cruisers, carriers, cavalry ships. It's not just them which are paused. You see, the example I'd use is probably Unicorn. Unicorn is the model for the light fleet carriers. Unicorn is a Royal Fleet Auxiliary. She takes 1,355 days to build, despite being a lot simpler to build than an Illustrious class, or anything like that. So realistically, she should have taken a lot less time to build. And the thing is, if you drop her down to 1,200 days, when I could argue you could drop her down to 900 or even 800 days. That's certainly what they're forecasting when she was started construction prior to the war. Then she's in service when Victorious goes to see the Americans. Simple point. You could have had the lovely Saratoga working with with HMS Victorious as USS Robin, and backed up by HMS Unicorn. Anyone want to guess what the Americans would have called HMS Unicorn? Because Victorious becomes USS Robin. So what does HMS Unicorn become? Does she become USS Nest? Anyone guess what she becomes? I just want to put that out there. I want to see what chat comes up with as what would the name of Unicorn be in US service. What would they call her on their code books? USS Raven, Batman, USS Eager Beaver. There's a few good ideas coming in. Macedonian. Batman is proving rather popular. Yeah, well, this is the point. And all we've done is we haven't invented new ships. We haven't given Britain any magical elixirs of life. We've just carried on building the ships. And by the way, here's the fun thing. They transfer all those people over. It takes about 2 to 3 months to get them involved. Then they find it's actually complicating things with those people. And then they move them back. Which is why you end up with a 6-month delay caused by it. So actually, absolutely twaddle all happens. And it's not just things like Unicorn which are delayed. It's a lot of other fleet auxiliaries, like tankers and other systems, are delayed by this maneuver. All sorts of ships. Anything which isn't a destroyer, an escort destroyer, a corvette, or a sloop. They move off for roughly 6 months. They move off for 6 months. So everything which isn't one of those categories is delayed. Think of that from the perspective of World War II. The lack of delay affects gun production. It affects everything because it's not just people moved in shipyards. There's people who move around gun foundries. There's gun production halted and paused because you don't need it for the ships. There's all sorts of issues caused which then need to be restarted. USS My Little Pony, USS Blue Jay, Bluebird, Pegasus coming in. Lots of interesting ideas. It's an absolute nuts point in history because let's be honest, Churchill made the right decision based on his World War I experience. His World War I experience said the only way you're going to get escorts produced by the Navy is if you push the Navy to do it, and that's when the Flower class soups and all those things come in. And he's right. The thing is, he wasn't the only one who learned the lessons from World War I, so did the Royal Navy. And the Royal Navy had actually ordered the Flower class corvettes, ordered the Hunt class escort destroyers, ordered the Black Swan class sloops and various other things in 1939, based on war coming in 1942 or after, so they would have them prepared in plenty of time. They're actually ordering them. So he's prescribing a medicine for a disease the Royal Navy doesn't have. It's a disease it had years ago. It's not a disease it had today. It's kind of like your doctor turning up and going, "Well, Mr. Clarke, you had whooping cough when you were a kid, didn't you?" "Yes." "How are your lungs?" "Fine. I'm doing exercise and I'm not coughing." "That's good. Here, take a whole load of steroids for your lungs." "Why?" "For your whooping cough." "But I haven't had that since I was a kid." "Well, you never know. Take it now, just in case." That wouldn't be sensible. No one would want to take those steroids. But sometimes I read books and people tell me this was a really good idea of Churchill's because it remembered the lessons of World War One and it sped up these emergency ships, these war emergencies. Or even worse, the ships are actually called emergency orders. I've seen books which list out the emergency orders which Churchill saves the country by ordering. And they're all ships ordered in March 1939. He is not First Sea Lord then. He is not First Lord of the Admiralty. He's not First Lord of the Admiralty for at least another 6-7 months when they're being ordered. He has nothing to do with them at all. They are not one iota to do with Churchill. He is involved in many things, but at this point he's neither a member of the Committee for Imperial Defence, nor is he Naval Secretary, or First Lord of the Admiralty. He has nothing to do with them. They are ordered months before war even begins. They are not war emergency ships. They are just useful small escorts. So, this is it. This is the history. Now, the alternate history is going to be after I've answered some questions, but I'm also going to do a shameless book plug. And that shameless book plug is going to include this. Now, you might have noticed that this week, the video scheduled for Tuesday, which is all about American flush deck cruisers, destroyers, of World War One, hasn't appeared. That's because this book arrived. And the thing is, before I did that video, I wanted to have read this book because I wanted to recommend it. Because this book is written by William Snowden Sims and Burton Jesse Hendricks. Now, Sims, of course, the US Navy Admiral who commanded the forces in World War One, and then was president of War College and an analyst and all sorts of things. Does a really good job and is basically the theorist which the fleet of World War II for the US Navy is based on the theories of. He's a really, really cool naval officer. I wanted to read this book and check if I recommend it first, because this book, it costs less than £3 currently. It's less than £3 on Amazon. Victory at Sea, William Snowden Sims, and Burton Jesse Hendrick. Less than £3 on Amazon. Now, I know I should be plugging my own book here and shamelessly going, my book's great. It is great. But this is less than £3. Less than £3. It's a very good copy. I have gone through it. Usually the copies are about 30, 40, 50 quid. And so they are well above impulse buy level. This is at £3. So if you buy this and just read it once, I consider it still worthwhile. But if you buy it and enjoy it and actually learn something from it and find it useful, then it's really, really useful. It is £3. Less than £3. Okay? That's useful. That is useful. So if you're interested, and the video will come out tomorrow on the destroyers because it will include the stuff about the book, but yeah. So let's do questions. I'm going to do questions and then I'm going to into the alternate history. So those, as Lord Chandler is putting into the chat, those who do not enjoy alternate history, look away after this. Okay, so I'm going to open up Discord and I'm going to get the questions out. Good luck with the freezer, Stafford. Good luck with the freezer. Don't drop it on your foot. I've done that to myself already this week moving a freezer. I do not recommend it. Freezers are actually quite heavy. Not as heavy as dishwashers before you remove the concrete, but they're quite heavy. And dropping on your foot does hurt. At least I'm told it does. For me, it just caused a lot of bruising, which, yeah. Which suggested it must have hurt a lot. Okay. Stafford. Unless touched on already, before the question is seen, how would the USN respond to the pause, if at all? And what would the respond to the pause at all? And what would the IGN do in response to the mass building program by the Iron? Honestly, this was part of their plan already. They knew what the British were planning. It had been announced. The British had been signposting their building. No one had really been flustered by the British actually building what they're supposed to be building. It's basically a case of, oh, the British are building what they've already announced they're building. It's not going to cause any issues. Brent Tonga. If Henderson had still been alive, would he have been able to explain some things to Churchill, and it would have been Henderson, would have Winston listened? Yes. And I say that not from a point of conceit. Henderson had been in a post for 6 years. He knew where the bodies were buried. He buried some of them quite literally himself. If anyway, that was one of the reasons why Churchill gets away with doing this and doing the damage he does, because he's dealing with quite a new team, a fairly new First Sea Lord, a new Third Sea Lord. None of them have got enough experience in their post to really fight him off. None have got experience in the post to really go toe-to-toe with him. And that's the thing. Henderson could marshal the Committee for Imperial Defence and all those things on his side. Channel. What were the secondary, tertiary arguments against the pause in construction of cavalry ships and carriers? The main ones are quite self-evident. Basically, utility of force. And also, the fact is your R-class and these things are quite old. And if you want to be able to support and defend these things, you want current ships. It's quite useful. You're going to be fighting modern ships. You might as well actually have modern ships. And more importantly, by building up the infrastructure, building these ships, you actually make it quicker and easier to build bigger other ships later. Nicely going. Without delaying King George V, Hood gets refit, but as she likely needs structural steel added due to hull load stress, won't the lack of delay mean decisions on where the ship modernizing come sooner? Not really. They've got plans already for modernizing Hood in place. They've worked her out. This is one of the things we'll be getting into. We'll be discussing it at the end. That's part of the end video, and literally the last slide of the video is about Hood's modernization, etc. and stuff, because my theory is if NFA ship's going to be sent as, if she's modernized, she'd be sent as flagship to Far East. Because she's going to be a status asset to be sent out there. So I'll talk about that in a bit. So now, okay, I bought the paperback edition for €7.51. Wayne's World of Science Tech. If there were 4 King George V's zones, which one coming does Bismarck stay on? Does Italy enter the war? This is what's going to be discussed as we go on. Italy probably still enters the war, because Mussolini joins the war because he thinks it's going to be over soon and he doesn't want to not be in part of the victory spoils. That's literally why he joins the war. He thinks it's going to be over soon. Mussolini literally is the one person on Earth who believed the war would be over by Christmas. And he didn't want to miss out on his present. Quite literally. The one person on Earth who believed that Christmas was the war would be over by Christmas. Simpson. Does deploying battleships quicker make a massive difference for the Atlantic thereafter, their theatre, or does it just affect the Indian Ocean Pacific by... It affects them all, because... it has an impact on what you have available in the Atlantic. It also has an impact on what you available. It's not just battleships, it's carriers, it's cruisers. It's what you have available in the Mediterranean. It's what you have available for various operations. And that's... as I try and explain things, a lot of these things, especially longer wars, are cumulative efforts. They are what you have is what you're going to fight the war with. And what you're going to see in terms of your reinforcements is mostly stuff you've already got on construction. So, if these things are coming into service, you're actually going to grow your force at key points in the war. What we're basically talking about, if we go back to this sort of some of this date timeline, Unicorn could have been in service by October 1942. That's useful. That's instead of well into 1943. These ships, we're talking about them being in service, in some cases, 6-7 months earlier than they were historically. Massively early. Formidable is only going to be a couple months early. That's nothing, really. That's just, it's beneficial, but no one's really going to, it's okay. It's okay. But the cumulative impact that could have on the war effort, as I said, Taranto. You think about it. You could still have Illustrious out there, but there is already a task group which passes through. There's already a part of the operations that go into making Toronto happen. A whole battleship is passed. Well, and a carrier, or even a pair of carriers, could be passed as part of that group. Could go through and join the battle, join the strike. Imagine that. 2 brand new carriers with brand new air groups on them coming in and joining the attack and going in for the hit. It changes the history. Or even more interesting, Formidable could have been sent out there earlier. She could have been out there early enough that Eagles actually able to be maintained and fixed. So when it comes to launching the strike in November 1940, or Victorious is out there earlier. They could have August and they could have Victorious and Formidable. Victorious could already been out there. They could have Eagle available. They could send in Formidable as well. You could end up with Eagle and 3 Illustriouses launching the strike. Imagine that'd be 96 Swordfish torpedo bombers. 96. Not the historic 24, which were taken along and launched. 96. And they got the King George V's. Again, this means things like, well, Hood can go in for a refit. Okay. Also, if we start looking at it, it means that you have, realistically, a lot of ships available for operations. All of this means that you have a larger force to pull from, and you're less likely to be wearing ships out. In this scenario, Ark Royal might well not get wrecked. You might have 2 carriers sitting in the Gibraltar as part of Force H. That's what we're talking about. It starts to wander across all the theatres. Tell me, so would this mean HMS Unicorn would have a sister ship? Potentially. But that's got to be ordered, and again, HMS Unicorn's sister ship was going to be called HMS Ocean. I've answered that one before. Channel. So the pause in Big 2 construction would also affect the escorts in NB benefit. Well done, Churchill. Yeah. It's one of those things of which sounds a really good idea on paper. It's a really politician thing of we're doing something. And yeah, what you're doing actually causes more trouble than help. Wait, hold on. So would someone have used the gag that they used on Loki? And no. I don't think that would have worked. But Henderson would probably talk to him now around. General. Caller in discussion. Miss Henderson made political attaché to First Sea Lord after her husband's death. Does the pause still concur? She pretty much still did work. She did all sorts of things, did Henderson's wife, after... she's actually... It's kind of interesting. She comes back in. She starts getting more and more involved as the war goes on. And doing more assistance. At the initial point, she doesn't have the power she would later have. But she very much starts to mobilise the wives' network as the war goes on. She's very, very capable lady. Very, very capable lady. And very well informed when it comes to ship construction. And very informed to what her husband was doing. Yes, it was a case of preparing for the last war. Lions, who was Third Sea Lord time who let this all go through? Fraser. Bruce Fraser. And Fraser hadn't had any training with Henderson because of the way Henderson, you must remember, Henderson dies. And dies unexpectedly. He's worked himself to death. So Fraser takes over unexpectedly without the normal handover from Third Sea Lord to new Third Sea Lord, without normal training. And Fraser is many things, but he's not a political admiral. He is a very good... He's a very good engineering admiral. He's a thorough admiral. He's a very solid personality to put in there. He's a safe pair of hands. He is not the kind of political beast you need to take on someone like Winston Churchill. So it's a case of, he's not a bad choice. He's just not the choice you need to deal with Churchill. Mm. Now, let's see everyone. As a lack of delay resulting in likely disassociating raid on Toronto, won't that change the war so radically that German plans are fallen off? It's going to be an interesting discussion we're going to get into. They're not going to be there in time to deal with Dunkirk, Mark Fram. They're not going to be there to help with Dunkirk. Leslie Mitchell, what would the Luftwaffe do more raids on the shipyards without the pause? Not really. The trouble for the Luftwaffe in doing the raids on the UK is not really set up for it. It was a really good discussion and really good paper with military aviation history, I think it was, at Drax conference last Saturday, and it was really, really good because what it was talking through was the realities of the Luftwaffe and the fact that realistically the high command hadn't really cared what aircraft were being procured as long as number of aircraft went up. And their bomber program suffers from that because their bomber program is always a lot weaker. And this is one of the interesting things, especially once you start to consider, well, okay, so let's say the Germans want to focus on bombing Harlan and Wolf. They're in Belfast. They have to cross the UK or fly round the UK to reach it. Same with a lot of the yards on the west coast of Scotland. Whilst the yards on the east coast and the south are able to be quite easily attacked, the ones on the west coast of Scotland and the ones even in Liverpool area, Camel Laird's and Birkenhead, etc., they will be attacked. There will be bombing raids about them, but that's always a bit of a special effort. There were lots of admirals around who were liking who you chatted, but he didn't listen to them. Churchill, that you needed serious political firepower to stop Churchill when he had his mind set up, and Twitt wasn't in the right position for that. Potentially, we'll be talking about that as it goes on. Prince Tonga, we'll be talking about that. How much did the pause in ships affect engine production? More than the British government would like to admit, especially when it came to producing the engines for the light fleet carriers, etc. There's a reason why a lot of them have cruiser tubing. Without that many carriers coming online, there are probably accelerated the procurement of US aircraft designs. With that, potentially. Honestly, the Swordfish is going to be around in numbers. Especially in the early war, the Swordfish is okay. So initially, 1939, 1940, this is okay. 1941, it starts to get a bit iffy, but again, it depends what you're fighting. It depends what you're fighting. For the Royal Navy, if you're doing operations in the Atlantic versus German ships, due to the fact they don't have a carrier with them, etc., Swordfish are perfectly adequate, especially for night strikes. Hello, Thunder King 161. Peter Dawson, you keep saying ad. I'm going to ask the question again, are you having them more often than every 30 minutes? Because it doesn't seem to be. Seems to be roughly every 30 minutes, roughly. Just checking. And a channel. Goering, the Luftwaffe had lost the Battle of Britain in part then. A lot of issues for the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. There were a lot. But anyway, with that being said, we're now going to get out of the alternate history into the history. The questions aren't being lost, they're in the solar system, and I will get to them at the end. So, the first really big event when you're going to have more assets around is going to be Taranto. The really big scenario. And to my mind, it does difference than the traditional sort of, I've done this before, of what happens if you have more carriers available. In this scenario, I have Formidable. And I had Formidable as part of the force. She's finished, she's there. I think it's a real possibility, with the amount of importance that's being attracted to the Mediterranean fleet at that point, that you would have Victorious sent down to assist with Force H. So you'd have Victorious with Force H. You probably have Formidable being sent to the Mediterranean fleet. The thing is, when Eagle gets damaged, they might dash Victorious through. They might dash through. They probably wouldn't. Probably leave her with Force H. Or they might put her send her round and send Formidable down to Force H. Either way, you probably end up with an Illustrious class with Force H along with Ark Royal, so that Ark Royal can take some maintenance and get some refits as well. And you probably end up with a second Illustrious class with the Mediterranean fleet, which means Eagle gets maintained. So my theory is you end up with the two Illustrious and Eagle carrying out the strike. I don't think Ark Royal and the third Illustrious are going to come in and take part in this. I don't think they are. The reason I don't think they are is because, again, it would go against the whole philosophy of the operation. But having Ark Royal with, let's say, operating with a second carrier, that suddenly starts to scare a lot of people. And having the Royal Navy have 3 carriers, because again, the Royal Navy is a multi-carrier force. That's the reason why Admiral Henderson was the first rear admiral aircraft carriers to develop the Royal Navy's multi-carrier tactics. One of the things they'd worked out to make up for the fact that they were armouring their carriers to make them more survivable in places like the Mediterranean South China Sea, because that's on their routes of advance if they're going to the Far East, etc., is they would make their air groups would be smaller. So they need to be multi-carrier air groups to be able to get efficiency of size and numbers for a decent strike. So the British have been going multi-carrier for quite a while at this point. So with that as an idea, the British had conceived of Taranto as a multi-carrier operation. From the get-go, it had always been a multi-carrier operation, usually involving Courageous and Glorious in the 1930s and the strategy and planning for that point, but also occasionally featuring Courageous, Glorious, and Furious. And as we did in talking about the designs, it was originally supposed to be Illustrious and Eagle. One of the reasons why Eagle is damaged is because when you've got 2 carriers, and both are going to be available, because you want to take 2 flight decks of you in case one gets damaged, you can keep your air defense. If you have 3 carriers on the station, you can afford to leave one behind for maintenance. So that's one of the reasons why Eagle doesn't get fixed when she should have been. And they keep pushing her and pushing her on. So, yes. And in this scenario, I think you end up with a 72 Swordfish strike. Now, 72 Swordfish probably also comes with some Fulmars. Now again, think about this. You need 12 Fulmars. You had some Sea Gladiators as well from Eagle and etc. They wanted to keep at least half the Fulmars back for air defense. But if they're taking the 12 of the Fulmars with them, which they could do, they could send 2 Fulmars with each of the strikes from each of the carriers to act as flare droppers. So they've got 4 Fulmars doing flare dropping. Okay, what does that mean? Well, historically the strike was made up of 24 aircraft, of which 12 carried torpedoes, 8 carried bombs, 4 carried flares. They were divided into 2 waves of 2, 4, and 6. Well, if you're doing 72 aircraft in the strike, you're probably going to do, and you've got plus 12 Fulmars, you're probably going to do 3 strikes. Well, that means you no longer need to worry about using Swordfish for flares, you've got Fulmars for that. And that means you've got 24 Swordfish per strike. So you're probably going to load them up with 16 torpedoes and 8 with bombs for each strike. Okay? Now, this scenario means that you're going to be taking in 48 torpedoes. Historically, they took in 12. They got roughly 5 hits. Okay? We're going to call it 5 hits. There's a debate. Call it 5 hits. it's not beyond conceivable to go up to 20 hits. And I did a whole video going into the maths of this and all the science of this called Henderson's Dream, Toronto with 4 carriers. So if you want to go see that video, that is a video on this channel. That was another patron suggestion, and that was done not that long ago. So you can go and find it. These are slides from that video. 20 torpedoes hitting their target. Oh, Lord. And not just the historical bomb load, okay? Not just 8 bombers, 8 swordfish loaded bombs. We're talking 24 dropping bombs. That's gonna crank up the number of hits as well. And again, those bombs might not be the most damaging in the world, but they are gonna cause some damage, and it's all gonna be cumulative. Just to answer your question, Knight 681 and people remind me to answer the question, they want to get it. If the Toronto raid like Pearl Harbor does knock out the Italian field facilities, won't that hurt the RN even if the strike does more damage? No. See, the difference is the Americans can rebuild their ships and repair their ships. The Italians can't. The Americans can repair their ships and rebuild new ships. The Italians honestly can't. So the Italians get enough damage in this scenario, you're talking knocking out the Regia Marina. You could actually have a scenario where, not like they talk about in the bubble, it wins, the control of the Mediterranean for 6 months. I'm talking that it does literally knock back the Italian fleet to Giglio Cesare as being the only vessel available. And for those who don't know, I have run the Battle of Taranto like 1,000 times, it feels like, but probably only a few hundred, through various simulator software. And unless you are taking skewered dive bombers, there is no frigging way to line up on the Giglio Cesare. I do not know who was in charge of the docking plan, but they love that ship and they're making sure no one can aim a torpedo at it. Just no one. Go and look at its positioning in the harbour. You cannot get a frigging clean torpedo shot at that ship without going straight over a AA's position or straight into another ship. And, by the way, this has a huge impact, because if this really does knock the Italians back to the fact that they're waiting for Roma, that they're waiting for, realistically, their other ships to be, maybe Littorio, to be actually into service. Not Littorio. It's their 4th one. I forgot the name of the 4th one. That's terrible. Impero. If they're waiting for Roma and Impero, because Littorio and Vittorio Veneto both get damaged in this attack, and get severely damaged, the Italians are in trouble. That's a good few months of their supplies can be ravaged by British battleships. And here's the thing, they're not even going to have the normal advantage they have of having a cruiser superiority, because, again, let's think about this, and we'll talk about this as we go on. There are a lot of cruisers to be sped up. There are a lot of cruisers coming in. A lot of cruisers. Neighbouring ships' magazines going boom does do damage in harbours. I hate Google a lot. So, with Taranto taking place with more emphasis than it did historically, that's going to cause troubles. That's also going to start freeing up resources. And if this takes place in November 1940, that's going to cause someone to start thinking. You see, King George V's entering service in numbers they are, that's going to push things back. Because now if you send out the Bismarck on a solo trip, what's it going to be running into? About 4 King George V's in service going, hello? An aircraft carrier or 2 worked up nicely, thank you, going, hello? Because here's the thing, if you have the big victory and the big strike against Taranto and the Italian fleet is damaged at that level, do you need to keep up such a force in the Mediterranean? Do the British need to keep carriers and capital ships down there? Can they afford to move Nelson and Rodney elsewhere? Admittedly, they are there as a coverage against the French, but to an extent, but how much force do you really need to cover against those issues? So, realistically, to my mind, this is going to cause a change of strategy, because for the Germans, now, sending out a lone capital ship is not possible. Your only real option is to start thinking of developing Tirpitz and the Graf Zeppelin, and having both into service. Both into service. Realistically, Tirpitz is not really ready for service before about June 1941. She's not ready for service till about June 1941, because you have to remember, the Germans commission their ships before they've gone through their trials. The British commission their ships after they've gone through their trials. So, Bismarck's commissioned in August 1940, Tirpitz in February 1941. If you really pushed, and if you knew this in October 1940, and you knew the only option is to get Graf Zeppelin ready before you can send the ships out, you start pushing Graf Zeppelin from about October 1940. October, November 1940. November 1940 will make it clear. Now, here's an interesting knock-on effect. Because we've been talking about how this affects, and this will have some of an impact, because you'll have more resources flowing around and those things going on. It will have some impact on escort production. It will have some. Not a dramatic impact, but some. The interesting point comes is, does the need to get a surface action group ready that is more than a single battleship, but is a couple of fast battleships, a couple of cruisers, a carrier ready for combat and operationally ready and viable, does that distract resources from U-boat effort? Now, here's the interesting thing. For the Germans, they'll be able to point to Norway and go, the British achieved dominance thanks to their carriers and battleships, and look what they've done in the Mediterranean to the Rage Marina thanks to their battleships and carriers. So Raider could actually push this through. Raider could actually build the case, based on what the Royal Navy's doing, for a carrier battle group with 2 battleships and a couple of cruisers as a raiding force to go into the Atlantic. The thing is, that's going to take till June, July 1941 to get it ready at the earliest. At the earliest. And if we go back here, well, if the British are pushing, they could probably have Unicorn available by that point, but leave that to one side. They would have all the Illustrious class in service by that point. Still possibly lost Courageous and Glorious. And would have all 5 the King George V's in service by that point. And could well have other ships coming on behind them, because Lion and Temeraire could be coming along. All sorts of things could be still being under construction, being pushed forward. So the point is, the natural remedy which the Germans would probably seek to deal with this huge force which the British are going around the world is their own huge honking force. Because, again, you have to remember, both Mussolini, Hitler, even Stalin and Mao, they are all dictators. And dictators are obsessed with looking like they are the biggest dictator in the world. They are really obsessed with being the absolute largest dictator they can physically be. That's their aim, that's their power, that's their position. They want to be seen to be powerful, to be the biggest dictator there is. And so, yeah. I could see, rather than them doubling down, because they haven't lost their large surface assets at this point, rather than them abandoning them, they double down on them. They're actually at the expense of submarines, the expense of the Air Force. They push in the cruisers, they push on the carrier, they put this all together as this force to go into the Atlantic and do battle with the Royal Navy. The big problem for this is the British will see this coming. They'll be bombing those yards with every single heavy bomber they can get them. Every single bomber they can get around them. And they will be, more importantly than that, they'll also be concentrating a force in Scapa Flow to deal with them. Now, it'll probably be centered on the 5 King George V's, but we'll probably have some illustrious glass carriers lined up on them, because the British will work on a policy of, if the Germans have 1 carrier, we need to have 2. If the Germans have 2 battleships, we need to have 5. And so that's what the British will scale up to. So what you can end up with is the Battle of Denmark Straits could be an almighty carrier and battleship duel, the likes of which were not seen at any other point in World War II. Because there is no other scenario where I could see fleets actually still joining into each other and charging at each other continuing, whilst the carriers are engaged in an almighty effort with their aircraft. We will end up with a carrier battle in the Atlantic. And it will be glorious. It will probably involve HMS Ark Royal. I'm fairly certain she will be pulled back to be the cornerstone of this force. I think probably she'd be tied up with 2 illustrious glass carriers as well. And that would be the force we base around them, as those 3 ships would be the core ones. It would be, yes, the normal version of a fair fight as the British consider it. Oh, we've got 2-to-1 superiority numbers. This might actually be fair. Do you think they have sharpened fruit? They might do, sir. Send in an extra battle squadron immediately. Because here's the thing. There is probably also going to be a slow group formed up, which will probably be centered on something like HMS Furious and Nelson and Rodney. And their job will be, once the fast group has caught you and has held you down, we come and join in. And that's the other thing. The other ships that are going to join this group, possibly Renown. I doubt it will be HMS Hood. I think she'll be in refit still at this point. But it will be an almighty clash. An almighty clash. Everything the British can get will be there. So, whilst I have no doubt the British will take casualties, the British will turn up with a task group, which will have a lot more cruisers than they did historically, because they'll have still been in construction. We'll have the carriers, we'll have more capital ships, and we'll probably have a lot of destroyers with them. Because the other thing is, if you're centering such a force together, you're not going to have travel-class destroyers going off and doing escorts. Well, Matthew Killing, it will technically be 3-to-1 standards at the time, because, think about it, the Germans will have 2 cruisers, 2 capital ships, and a carrier. The British will have destroyers, probably tribals, but a lot of others as well. Probably some of the J, K, and N's will be with them. And they won't be joking around. And you will probably have quite a fair number of cruisers. probably towns, crown colonies, and counties, i.e. the big first-rank cruisers. You will then have to deal with the German cruisers, so then you'll have the King George V's, Renown, Repulse, whatever fast ships they can grab as a fast group. Rodney and Nelson sitting around ready to be called up. You'll have a fully heavy force to go, so you want to come play? And if the Germans do get Scharnhorst and Gneisenau through, if they wait for the Channel Dash to get them through, then it'll be even more concentration of force. But the thing is, if they wait for the Channel Dash, and then they wait for the major refit which Scharnhorst and Gneisenau have to go through to be able to get themselves viable for operations after the Channel Dash, that's time for Lions to come on service. That is time for HMS Hood to come out of refit. This is the problem. The longer the Germans wait, time is not on their side. If the British don't pause construction, it's kind of like the whole scenario with the naval race. If the British hadn't been trying to go cheap and only order 1 dreadnought and then order 3 battleships the next year and this and that, instead of ordering their normal 4 every year, the Germans would have never stood a chance. There would have never been a case of, the Germans are closing the gap, have a panic. Would never have happened. And it's the same with this. If the British don't pause in 1939, at no point is German construction getting anywhere close, because the Navy is not even the second service in their force structure in what they're prepared to spend money on. It's the 4th. It's behind the Army, the SS, and the Air Force. So the thing is, a really fun thing, is if this battle happens, you get Tirpitz and Bismarck knocked out. I don't think they wait for Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, I just don't. Tirpitz, Bismarck, you lose Graf Zeppelin, you lose a couple of cruisers, probably. You have a big fleet battle. And the British probably do suffer losses. Hi, Ravens. But the point is, if you've had this happen, and you've had this happen, then the British commitments in the European theatre have dropped down massively in terms of capital ships and carriers and cruisers, because of what now is available to their enemy forces. And it gets even worse in the Mediterranean once you consider the cumulative of the cruisers. The average, if we say an average for cruiser build is 800 days, right? An average is 800 days. We'll get to the Implacables, don't worry, Revan. 800 days. Then you see Bermuda, and I'd like to point this out just to give you an example of how big a difference this is, all right? So Bermuda historically enters service in August 1942. Could have been completed in February 1942. Ceylon enters service in July 1943. She could have been completed in July 1941. Ceylon enters service in July 1943. She could have entered service in July 1941. Think about that. And then you've got Argonaut and Diadem. Argonaut is, of course, Dido class. Diadem is improved. It's Bellona subgroup. And, well, the first ones were Crown Colonies. Argonaut, historically, she's finished in August 1942. She could have been finished in January 1942. Diadem is finished in, well, in this scenario, in March 1943. Historically, Diadem isn't finished till January 1944. So the point is, these ships would have been finished. They would have been launched earlier. They would have been built and finished earlier. They'd have been off the slips. They'd have been into service. They'd have had the slipways cleared. They'd have been done, commissioned, in service, useful assets. You have the personnel for them. You're still expanding Navy. You have all that thing. You have these ships in service. So that means, think about it, put this another way. Everywhere you see 2 or 3 cruisers, you could have sent 4 or 5 cruisers. And that's a really fun thing. So when people tell you Britain was suffering from a cruiser shortage in World War II, they are right. When they tell you it's suffering from a carrier shortage in World War II, they are right. When they tell you it's suffering from a capital ship shortage, they are right. If they tell you it's due to finances in the 1920s and 30s, or they tell you it's due to anything other than Britain being a sodding idiotic country in 1939 in some decisions it's made, they are wrong. Because I'm sorry. Without the pause, this is all in service. And the thing is, that means the Royal Navy's then working on the next class of ships which come after them. They're working on the Minotaurs, they're working on the Neptunes, and they're actually going to enter service. If you consider the Minotaurs, laid down in 1941, most of them do not enter service till 1945. One of the reasons why they take so long to be built and enter service is because of the huge backlog still being completed in front of them. The huge backlog. People tell you one decision doesn't change history. They are right to an extent. It's rarely one decision that changes history. But in this case, the pause, for which Churchill pretty much is solely responsible, because he pushes it through against the advice of every admiral pretty much looking at him who's currently serving at the time, and even half of the other government. There you go. So yes, all this was viable. All this was actually possible. And you start going through the battles, the second battles of Sirte, and all these things in the Mediterranean, and you start factoring in what happens if the Italians have less capital ships because they've all been damaged, and the British have more cruisers. The fact is, with enough cruisers, etc., imagine what Force K is getting up to in the Mediterranean. If Force K is able to concentrate on being a cruiser force, because you have enough cruisers you can keep risking them, rather than what historically happens is the Force K initially starts out as a pair of cruisers and pair of destroyers, and they manage to get damaged in the minefield, and they can't replace the cruisers, so that again goes down to being just destroyers. But imagine they've got enough cruisers that, well, we've lost them, but Force K was really useful, so, well, we're going to put in some more cruisers back in those positions. The realistic thing is the Royal Navy being able to do more in the Norths in the Mediterranean because of more cruiser forces, to interdict more convoys, cause more damage to the Axis supply forces, means the odds are North Africa campaign gets tremendously easier. Because, as anyone who's studied North Africa campaign will tell you, it is a campaign of logistics. And regularly, the Italians and the Italians, because they are the majority force of the Axis forces out there, are at the end of the logistics, and the Germans are even worse. So you cut off those logistics more. Those forces collapse. Because the British can supply their forces by going round the Mediterranean and round Africa and coming up through the Red Sea to Suez. They can supply their forces by never entering the Mediterranean. The Italians have to fight their convoys through the Mediterranean. The only convoys Ronnie has to fight through the Mediterranean are those to supply Malta. Fun thing. You win in North Africa quickly, Malta resupply becomes really easy. And the Suez and Mediterranean, you just hug the southern Mediterranean shore, and on your path to the Suez, and you bounce from air cover to air cover, and you have protection the whole way along, and you can rapidly have convoys going through to the Far East. This is what you're building up to. This is what the reality of this all is. So yeah. Cruiser construction is useful. Having these cruisers is useful. They provide top cover to the force structure. They provide all this additional. And what happens? Does Crete fall? Well, again, we've talked about this before in the past with Crete, and I hate Google. I'll answer this one now. If Taranto causes enough damage that the Italians don't feel they can move out and can't support their forces and can't do an amphibious operation to support the assault, then you don't get the amphibious operation landing its reinforcements and its troops and its munitions and equipment, and Crete might not fall. Crete might not fall. It might still fall. Let's be honest. But if Churchill hasn't caused a pause, you never know, he might also not insist on changing the command structure and might not remove the Royal Marine who'd actually been organising everything and replacing with an army officer who had not been there before and had no idea what was going on until he arrived and was dropped into it all. You never know. There's always a possibility that sensibility strikes multiple times. And realistically, this would be a scenario where you could see the Regia Marina, etc., and forces being forced back to the northern Mediterranean, being forced back away from the North African coast. You could see their convoys being stopped by harassment by cruisers and submarines. And you could basically see the point ending up being, well, okay, North Africa campaign's over. And that then starts to change history a bit, because the British win in North Africa without anyone else's other than it's the British Empire and the free forces, victory in North Africa. That changes things. But also, more importantly, if that happens in 1941, well, that suddenly makes this different. Because you could end up with a Force Z being deployed to the Far East, Force Z, which is centered on a modernized HMS Hood as flagship, a couple of King George V's, because let's be honest, without Bismarck interprets around, do you need more than 2 or 3 of those sitting around in case Charles and Eisenhower come out? You really don't. Probably Renown and Repulse, because that gives you a very fast wing. At least 2 illustrious class carriers, plus HMS Eagle and Hermes probably deployed out there. Because again, if you win in North Africa, you do not need to have the same you're not going to be doing the same convoy operations in the Mediterranean in 42. You're not going to be running those risks. You're going to be sending this force out there. 4C starts to look quite scary. And the Implacables, well, if we consider how long they historically took to build, you could have had HMS Implacable joining in June 1943 and Indefatigable in June 1942 and Indefatigable joining in March 1943. Japan, the R's are the R-class battleships were already out in the Far East, acting as convoy escorts in the Indian Ocean. The point is, you have a significant force deployed out there. Let's be honest. If you now share a land border in Africa with Vichy France, hello, Big Fluffy, come to join us. If you've added that onto it, well, and you suddenly have a range of things for getting in. You can send a whole load of French officers who are serving with the Free French forces already, could go and visit their friends in North Africa and say, well, would you like to come serve with us? It could turn French North Africa into the best recruitment ground for the Free French forces in the world. Hello, you needed to change sweater. You're a good boy. You're a good boy. Now, the thing is, with Force Z being deployed like that, there is going to be none of the whole sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse because of air cover. Because, let's be honest, if those torpedo bombers launch a strike on that group, well, 2 illustrious class carriers, that's going to be enough fighters to deal with that threat. That's going to be enough fighters to deal with that threat. Even if they're carrying full Mars, that's going to be enough fighters to deal with that threat. As we talked about before, those bombers that historically attack Force Z, they are running without defensive guns, so they can carry enough fuel to do the range, and they are already returning on fumes. That's... Full Mars would go, hello! Oh my! Have you come to say hello? Really? And at this point, you really have started to change the war, because you then probably have things like scenarios like Saratoga, or variously the American forces, probably American naval forces in the area which are around, do sink down. ABDA command will be centered on Force Z, because let's be honest, it's a fleet. This is a chunk of fleets. This is not a force which is going to be picked off by the Japanese sending what they have available that's not dealing with the Americans. This is going to require the attention of the full Kido Butai. This is going to require a lot of attention. And by the time the Kido Butai gets out there, who knows what they've been reinforced by. And again, the other scenario is you could have very much a scenario where Singapore doesn't fall, Malaya might not fall, because let's be honest, if this force is ravaging up the coast going, where are these Japanese landing craft? We are looking for landing craft. Where are you? Oh, there you are. You have a couple of cruisers as escort. Oh, lovely. The King George V, this is going to be a race between Hood, Renown, Repulse, and the King George V to go, that's mine. And this is the reality of what you're dealing with. This is that force. The Japanese probably don't do those attacks because they're not that stupid. The Japanese are going to look at that force and go, okay, we're going to have to do 2 phases. We're going to have to do the Kido Butai operation. We're going to do the attack on the Philippines. And then we're going to have to build up and do an attack on Malaya. And the trouble is, again, for the Japanese, is kind of like the Germans and the Italians. The more time they give to the powers to build up, the more problematic it gets. Because if the Japanese decide they're going to send down a carrier force to engage this, they're going to master Kido Butai, where do you think the Americans are going to send their carriers? It won't be the Battle of Midway, it'll be the Battle of the South China Sea. And it'll be 3 British carriers and 3 American carriers versus the Japanese going, hello! In which case you could have a scenario where it's basically the British and the Americans look at each other and go, so our strike carriers aren't available yet. Really? No. Or maybe the British have got Ark Royal out there and they go, well, we've got Ark Royal, we've got 2 illustrious class, We've got Unicorn, and we've got Eagle and Hermes, plus we've got your free carriers. So, yeah, let's take on the Keto Batai. And this becomes a very interesting scenario. Because the thing is, the Royal Navy doesn't need to focus as much on the Mediterranean and the European theatre, because there is no Tirpitz, there is no Bismarck. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are damaged, and mostly, let's be honest, in the case of Gneisenau, mostly in harbour getting fixed and upgraded. That's the plausible thing. She's getting upgraded for 15-inch guns. She's also absolutely damaged. So the only thing the Germans have available is Scharnhorst sitting in in Northern Europe. Okay, free King George V sitting there are enough cover for that. The Italians, well, historically, they only complete Roma. They don't complete the Impero. So there is a real scenario where they have Gillo Cesare and Roma's not completed until June 1942, and by that point, who knows what they're taking on? There could be the British could well have a lion sitting in the Mediterranean, going, "Come on, you want to come play? Come play." There's another reason why you might even be more King George V's deployed to the Far East, because lions might have ended service. In which case, you deployed a Luster of the fleet which fought the Germans and won at Denmark Straits. The great fleet that fought the Battle of the Atlantic against the Germans. That's suddenly a pretty scary force. And it might be Cunningham sent, it might be Somerville, it might be the Admiral who'd been in charge. You know, think about this. If Tovey does really well with sinking the Bismarck and running this fleet, it could be Admiral Tovey, as part of his victory, is deployed with his fleet to go and deter the Japanese in the Far East. You're all thinking Cunningham. Cunningham's useful wandering around doing other things. It could be Tovey. There are other options. Again, Tovey will have had a big, massive fleet battle. Poor Cunningham, well, let's be honest. How likely is he to get a battle at Cape Matapan in March 1941 if the Italians have been as mullered as they were historically, has been mullered as they might have been, as in this Taranto scenario? And there is that, Michael Glush. If the Italians have lost their fleet and in African colonies, do they sue for peace? Does Mussolini stay in power? He's not that popular. He's not that strong. This is what we're talking about. Force Z suddenly becomes completely different. By now, there is no historical accuracy about what I'm talking about. This is entirely my opinion. Okay, but I'm going to go trade back in time, because U-boat war. The whole thing is this, is we're going to be talking about U-boat war, but if the Germans go down the route of trying to fight fire with fire, which, let's be honest, is what they were doing up until about 1941 anyway, then this doesn't have any impact on this. And Harland and Wolff is a good example. They're the only builder which truly overlaps, and mostly they're using their spare auxiliary spaces to build flower classes. So I don't think it has any impact, and that's a really interesting thing again, because think about this. The British are building their ships, their escorts, ordering flower class and hunt class destroyers with no relation at all to the events that are actually taking place. They are just ordering by the bulk. The fear of World War I and the damage and threat that created means the British are just pressing order, 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 and repeat on escort orders, right? So if the U-boats are slower to build up and slower to get into service because the Germans have been concentrating on getting a carrier into service and trying to get that working and getting cruisers and battleships lined up and ready for operations, then we have an interesting scenario going on whereby the Royal Navy escorts might actually be even further ahead than they were historically of the submarines in numbers. And that could lead to a bigger loss rate for the submarines. Because here's the thing. If you have slightly less submarines, how much easier does it become for the Royal Navy to accidentally scare using all that lovely data from Bletchley Park, all that signals traffic analysis data, let alone cracking the Enigma, the traffic analysis data, to make sure that the convoys which the Wolfpacks happen to bash into, A, are not carrying the critical materials, and B, have a surprisingly heavy escort. And things get worse. World wars are not won by dashing actions and glory. They are won by logistics and numbers. They're won by persistence of force. Who starts off with the greater force and can maintain that force, at best, tends to win. It's cumulative. The more submarines you lose, the more destroyers you lose, the more institutional memory you lose earlier in the war, the outside impact it's going to have on your ability to grow your force structure. You know, we usually use the example of the German destroyers being lost in Norway and how that affects their ability to grow their destroyer numbers because they can't generate enough destroyer officers to actually crew them, so there's no point building them. Well, for the Royal Navy, there's a similar problem, remember? They lose courageous and they lose glorious. And they lose a whole set of trainee and new officers who are damage control experts for their carriers, which is one of the reasons why they then lose Ark Royal. Because they have a damage control officer who's come from other ships, which, let's be honest, the thing you do, the thing that's built in as actual central nervous system, is you do not flood your ship. In every other vessel other than an aircraft carrier, it is your instinctual muscle memory not to flood your ship. In an aircraft carrier, damage control, almost immediately you start flooding the ship because an aircraft carrier is top heavy. Now, here's the interesting thing. A, with the growth in numbers, that's going to be even more effective and more going around. But also, you're going to have more officers going in and going around for that training and for those roles. But you're going to have more chance to sustain that memory, British. And then conversely, for the Germans, if they're losing more submarines because they have less, so the vessels they lose are a bigger proportion of their actual overall force structure, that's going to have an outside impact. And this makes life interesting. Very interesting. Happy birthday, Night Wolf. So then we get to a summary point. Because realistically, you can't go much further than December 1941, January 1942. You really can't go further in this scenario. And here you go, courtesy of Draken FL, you have a hood which is modernized by taking stuff ordered for Vanguard. And that is probably the quickest way to modernize and upgrade her. Which is what they could have done. They could have done. And this all makes things interesting for the Royal Navy in World War II. Because if you have this basic construction going on, you suddenly have the Royal Navy coming out of World War II with other ships built. Because if there's no pause in large fleet carrier construction, the question is, do they do actually the light fleets, or do they concentrate on the fleet carriers? Does the Royal Navy still do the massive light fleet carrier construction program? They might do it. They have got HMS Unicorn, which they base it off. So they could do that. They could. But they don't necessarily do that. You see, we think of the massive carriers produced as an inevitable thing. You know, the whole Essex swarm, etc., as being a standard thing. But if you have that big battle in the South China Sea, and you have the American and Royal Navy carrier forces joined together, you could well see the Kido Butai wiped out in that battle. Could be a nighttime strike from the British, followed by a dawn strike from the Americans. And that would be horrendous. That would be devastating for the Japanese. That's the likely doctrine. Remember, British doctrine is to hit the Japanese at night. It's to hit everyone at night. They're going for that on Operation C. If they hadn't managed to mistranspose a number, they literally flipped two numbers around, and it target destination, the Royal Navy carriers hit the Kido Butai at night during their Indian Ocean raid. That is British doctrine. That is British doctrine. And that becomes a very interesting thing to think about. Because if then you don't need to do the massive carrier swarm, and the Japanese haven't got into Malaya, and they're pushed back, and you've got achieved fleet dominance, well, A, the relationship with Australia is going to be different. Because Australia is going to see the Royal Navy coming to their protection, so that's going to change that narrative. You could well be talking about the British and the Americans pushing the Japanese back to far closer to Japan by the end of 1942. They could have already started the retaking operations. You could well be talking about a scenario where maybe Italy has dropped out the war, has sued for peace, and Germany's probably still invaded the Soviet Union. But Germany, which is fighting in the Soviet Union, but is also has lost their fleet, their surface fleet, so it's concentrating probably on submarines by about this point. It becomes really, really scary to think about the changes in history. Because people already put in chat, this could be shortening the war by a year. It could be. It could be. And the thing is, the limitations placed on most of the Axis partners, on Italy, on Germany, on Japan, are the limits of their infrastructure and the amount of money they're able to spend on these things. So they can't really change what they're doing. The ones who have freedom of maneuver realistically are the Allies. They're the ones who have the depth of infrastructure and depth of funding and the ability to maneuver the spending around.
It's... It's going to be a very different scenario. It's going to be a war where, realistically, kind of like World War One, the naval war is going to be over by about 2 to 3 years into the war. And it's then going to be a logistics and the ground war, realistically, where everything else is going to be supporting and assisting and making sure the troops can get there. So the British will probably be, especially if Italy's dropped out the war, if Italy drops out, how do the Germans react to that? Well, if the worst thing the Germans can do, especially in 1941, 42, if the Italians drop out the war before the Germans have sufficient troops in Italy, then there are problems. They can't really storm across the mountains into Italy. If they have troops there already, the pass is already secured, they can get into Italy. If they don't have the passes secured, they can't. So if the Italians secure the passes and secure their positions, they can hold. Suddenly, the interesting thing becomes, okay, the Germans have opened up another front for themselves, fighting the Italians. And the Italian troops in facing off against the communist Russians, well, do some of them switch sides and start fighting on the side of the Soviets? There's literally sections of the German line in Russia which is held by Italian formations. It boggles your mind what could happen. With North Africa gone, they don't have to sustain North Africa. They also don't have to sustain Ranger Marina. The Japanese, if they've had a massive carrier battle in the South China Sea versus the combined Royal Navy and US Navy operating on a nighttime, daytime strike roles, they're in trouble. And let's be honest, the British have a fairly decent surface search radar from aircraft, even from things like the Swordfish at this point, which is one reason why Swordfish are in the Indian Ocean for Operation C, is their radar is very good, so they're used to go hunting for enemy formations. I could just imagine the history of the history of the South China Sea, if it's a case of, and the British Fulmars helped defend the American carriers from air attack in the South China Sea by being organised by their radar and radar directed, and the American fighters ended up having to form up with pairs of the British carriers, pairs of the Fulmars, because the Fulmars could coordinate with their carriers, whereas the American fighters couldn't at that point. And that's how they did their air defence operations. And it was a British Swordfish which was tracking the fleet, which guided in the Americans to do the dawn strike on the Japanese fleet, because it was sitting over them with radar, this biplane. Just imagine the movie that would be made about that biplane in America. It would be humongous. Hello. Yes, you're cute. You're cute. It was just... The whole thing changes quite dramatically, and literally all that's done... The British haven't built anything fancy. They haven't jumped... They just kept building the ships. They didn't pause them, and didn't deal with all the consequences of the pause. That's fine, Timo. My plan was always to allow basically 45 minutes to an hour for questions at the end. That's what I'm basically timing for. So I'm timing to finish this talk about 2 hours in, which I am approaching. Malgard, the American movie would still give the Swordfish an American pilot. No, it would give the Swordfish pilot an American girlfriend, let's be honest. That's what it would do. He'd be sitting there flying his plane with a picture of his American girlfriend in his plane. We all know that's what would happen. You're cute. Questions time? Shall we answer some questions now? You don't want to answer questions about biscuits? Well, you've had a fun day. You really have, and your ears were hurting because there's been lots of loud noises today, and it doesn't help with a poor puppy dog with ear disease, with earache. So we'll add in some biscuits. No, you're not getting one that just fell on the floor. You're getting them given to you. Sit. Good boy. Right then. So we were not get a cinematic masterpiece of the Pearl Harbor. Okay. Let's open up the questions. We'll push that to that. We'll do that. Okay. Listen, as the bomber force is mostly twin-engine and medium and light bombers, you need heavy bombers for raid on the UK, and the Luftwaffe don't have that. Wasn't a moot point bombing shipyards. They'd have probably tried it. Let's be honest, they'd have tried it. They might have even developed some heavy bombers. You never know. They might have actually put in money to develop their heavy bomb programs. They do have some programs they're working on, and some interesting aircraft, but the trouble is, realistically, the heavy bombers always lose out to other considerations. They always lose out to other considerations. Black Horse. How would the increase in capital ships affect the German service forces like the Scharnhorst? As said, that's what they have. They can't really do much else. It's going to make the convoy system kind of different again. One of the things you might see is, especially if the Germans are down to literally just Scharnhorst being available, whilst that's a threat, it's going to be a case of what forces do we need to confront Scharnhorst versus what forces we need to confront Tirpitz. There's a very different force dynamic necessary there. So that's going to affect things. Sakavdon. Would the Luftwaffe, for whatever reason, decide to bomb Belfast at the level to interdict shipyards in Belfast count as handing out free target practice to RAF with no pause? Look, they did launch raids on Belfast. Don't get me wrong, they did attack Belfast. But the thing is, for the Nazis and for Germany in World War II, focusing too much on Belfast is very much a hazardous operation. It would almost be, you're saying it's target practice to the RAF, but it would be a case of, okay, so our fighters can get you on the way there and the way back. Be quite literally the British could be organising waves of fighters to engage them. They could have fighters in Northern Ireland for when they get there. They could have fighters that could intercept them on the way out, flying from Cornwall or flying from Scotland if they're trying to fly around the UK, or flying from just southern England. They're going over them. We'll go and attack them, and then on the way back, here come the German bombers on their way home. Engage. It's a long flight. And it's going to be prone to a lot of attacks, and it's going to be literally over or round a lot of British fighter fields. And again, this is going to sound terrible, but especially if you're going over things like the fighters in force in Cornwall and the fighter force in Wales and the fighter force in Scotland, those are fighter forces which realistically are there because they have to be, because they don't want the Germans using those areas. But those aren't fighter forces which are getting necessarily as much action as the southeast. And so they will race at the chance to go and engage someone. They really will. Prince of Tonga.
With a more powerful Mediterranean fleet, does the Africa Corps even make it to Africa? From a personal perspective, that could mean my grandfather isn't winning on North Africa. It could mean that it's going to depend on what happens, but if Taranto takes place as we talked about in this scenario, the Africa Corps might well be either delayed or de facto not deployed. And if Crete especially doesn't fall, then yeah, could well be the writing on the wall from North Africa for a lot earlier and a lot longer. So if the Germans want to hit Harlem Wolf, they need at least one carrier. That would theoretically be an option for a carrier. It would not be a very good option for a carrier in this scenario for the Germans if they use their one carrier for such an operation. It would be literally... Well, if you want fun, go and look up at where the Royal Navy submarines like to go and practice in World War II for their training off the northeast coast of the northwest coast of Scotland. And any carrier hailing for Harland Wolf from Germany probably would use the Norway run, so probably end up going through there. That's not a good scenario. It's literally the Royal Navy submarines going, there is a German carrier coming right into our torpedo target area. The Germans have provided the target practice. If it even gets that far. 1981. Given the Taranto raid, like Pearl Harbor, answered that one earlier. Black Horse. Could a really effective Taranto mean that that Mussolini is kicked out of power earlier than historically? Potentially. Especially if it's combined with the loss of North Africa, that could mean, yes, Fat Boy, Fun Boy, the less improved Italian edition of World War II, is kicked out of power very early. Channel, if this pause is not implemented, does this mean Major Vanguard, possibly Sisters, are ordered earlier than historically? Probably not. To an extent, partially, when they are ordered and when they are instructed, it's partially to deal with the requirements. Pausing construction is not ordering new ones. Not pausing doesn't mean ordering new ones. So I could see ships like Lion class being completed and Lion and Temeraire, especially as they've been laid down, those things. But I don't see them necessarily ordering new ships. So it might well be Lion, Temeraire, and Vanguard are completed. Who knows? There's a possibility, but there's also a possibility that if you... Let's put it this way. Vanguard is a very nice, fully armoured battlecruiser. And there's a reason she's called a fully armed battlecruiser, not a fast battleship. Lion-class King George V's are called fast battleships. There is a difference, believe it or not. It's not the skin, it's the beneath the skin. There is the difference. But the scenario would certainly be interesting. If you're building the Lion class, do you build Vanguard? If you're being to the Lion class and you're modernizing Hood, does Vanguard have a role that's distinct enough to justify paying for it when you're doing the Lions? I would argue potentially not. The British Fat Boy Fun Boy Seneca Nero is Henry VIII. American Fat Boy Fun Boy. Honestly, the closest is a debate as to who is if they are fat enough or are fun enough. That's the trouble. The thing is, Night doesn't like a pause affect Operation Berlin. It probably does, and it doesn't. The thing is, the Berlin takes place in January to March 1941, and again, if we go back to this point and discussion here when I'm talking about the battleships, especially, realistically. you would have Prince of Wales in service, but Duke of York doesn't join until February 1941 in service, and Howe's April 1941. So you'd have Duke of York coming into service, you would have Prince of Wales available, but you wouldn't really have a much greater force or a much different force in terms of your capital ships to spread around. And the way Shah Norse and Eisenhower run it, probably not. You're going to have more carriers, but as said, they could well be in October 1940, and that sort of period, they would probably be off in the Mediterranean. And so that means they're not really there for January to March 1941. Black Horse, how would this scenario affect the US Navy in the Pacific? I think I've already covered that, but basically I think the forces are doing a bit more information sharing, a bit more hello, we're both here. And there is an argument that it makes the job more interesting about what's going on around the world. You might end up with, in effect, the British and the Americans almost operating a combined fleet going around the world, depending on which theatre is the critical theatre. Or alternatively, they're just concentrating. They've got enough force, and they just concentrate their force in the Pacific. And it's just basically they're both building up forces in the Pacific, and both trying to get close to Japan for their operations there. Loudwood, even if the Germans were able to get a carrier into water, do you think they did get Zeppelin in the water? The Graf Zeppelin did get into the water. It was floating around as a hulk, but it was in the water. Do you think they'd be able to accumulate enough experience to produce a dedicated aircraft package to try and employ their carrier? Oh, they definitely produced something they believed could work. Whether it would actually work at an efficient level, I've done enough videos about Graf Zeppelin to say what I think its problems are going to be. It has a lot of things which are great theoretically. Brilliant theoretically. But in practice, I worry about them, and as accumulation, I worry there's too many of those things, that if any one of them is not working properly, they're going to be in trouble. And they spent way too much time looking at the French as if they had good ideas on carrier design. Prince Logan, does a class of 9.2-inch cruisers actually get built in this alternate reality? No idea. Honestly, no idea. There's a possibility, but there's also a possibility not. There's an argument of who would they be building them to fight? And would they really be useful, or would it be better to just order more 6-inch cruisers like they did historically? They might do it, but it's doubtful. It'd be interesting to see what happens. Is there a chance you could knock Italy out the wall by just denying the Mediterranean? There is a chance, but I'd say victory in North Africa and the Mediterranean early enough, especially before there are any German troops sitting in Italy, that could well have the impact. And also, the thing is, there isn't much support for things like Fleet Corps 10. Honestly, Fleet Corps 10, if they lose, and if they take losses, getting replacements for them is very, very difficult, because the Luftwaffe really isn't structured around anti-shipping role and setting a large forces for anti-shipping. So yeah, that's also going to have an impact on operations. Hello, Chopper. You chopping? Hello. Yes, you're cute. You are cute. I think you're asking after a biscuit. You realise you eat more than me. Yes, you do. Today, I have had 2 homemade burgers. And that's all the food I've had all day. And you have had breakfast, you have had lunch, and you've had dinner before you've come in here. I know you have. And you'll then have snacks in the evening. How you are not the size of the house, I do not know. Probably because I take you on lots and lots of wanders. But the thing is, that doesn't help me. I do not know. I can walk you to Kingdom Come, and it doesn't help me. Probably because you keep stopping to go to the facilities. I Google a lot. The Germans wouldn't be able to provide support for a larger force, would they? They only barely had enough for the smaller raiding forces. Well, that's what I said. If they want to go for a larger force, they are going to have to concentrate assets, which is why you would have less support going for the submarines. So the only way they can get that force together is actually they take resources from elsewhere. So it's going to have to be the U-boats. Don't put second breakfast into his lexicon. It's bad enough when I let him watch Lord of the Rings. I swear he thought it was a Hobbit for the next 6 months. So, you know, basically they can support the larger raiding force, but then they're going to have to not support something else. Pretty much, Paul Emmis. Does Germany changing other warships to new their ability to build U-boats quickly? Pretty much. Pausing construction might have lengthened the war by about a year and a half. That seems to be a crazy butterfly proposal. I have seen various people put stats on it, and the trouble is... the reality you get is it's not so much as it lengthens the war, is there is a certain amount of time it takes to logistically build up the forces necessary to do things. So whilst you probably have less islands to retake off the Japanese, and they don't get as far south, and especially if they don't take Malaya and they get held back by ABDA command, which is now a lot more stronger, so basically the Japanese don't push it, and all these things, you do still have the time necessary taken to build up the force structure you need to doing those operations, like potentially invading Japan, like potentially invading Germany, like, you know, D-Day, etc. So those are probably still going to happen. That's going to take a while. It could happen earlier if you don't have to focus the resources. It could happen earlier. It might not happen earlier because it still takes time to build the factories, to build the equipment, to train the personnel to use the equipment, to deploy the AP personnel and the equipment across the world to where they need to be used, to use the equipment, to use those personnel equipment to achieve those effects. So, I'd say it could shorten the war, but I'm not sure. I don't know if a year and a half, that seems a very generous option to me. He's walking with 4 legs, you're walking 2. He's clearly using more energy. Plus he stops to sniff every 5 seconds. How much criticism of the Pauls have you found in the files and personal diaries? There is quite a lot. There's also quite a lot being censored. And it's one of those things of, you will find a lot of justification for the Pauls is written post-World War II. Again, this is one of the points I make. People go, well, there's this paper and this paper justifying post-World War II, written by various friends of Churchill. And it's contemporaneous. And I go, yes, it's written 1948. 1950. Or it's written after Churchill's published his memoirs. And as me and Darius were talking about when we discuss about World War I, there is a huge difference in how Haig is treated before his death versus after his death, after the publication of Lloyd George's memoirs. Lloyd George waits for Haig to die to publish his memoirs, which basically push all the blame for all the bad things onto Haig, and basically does a hit job on Haig. Now, some of it's not without merit. I do not say it's all without merit. But a lot of it is generally pushing the blame. And this is a similar scenario for what's remembered about these decisions by people prior to Churchill publishing his memoirs versus after him publishing his memoirs. Sidham, the lack of severe change in North Africa campaign might cause Barbarossa not to happen or delay it considerably. Undoubtedly, unlikely. Hitler was obsessed. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. An example, and I would give for the memoirs is, how many of you have read in books that Flower class and the Hunt class are war emergency designs? How many people have read the things of, oh, they were a quick design chucked together with an available vessel?
Versus, well, this was actually part of an ongoing study program. They'd worked it out using the sloops. They'd picked the design, and they'd ordered it in March 1939, well before war began. How many have read in books? The first option of it was a rapid emergency war design versus option 2 of it actually being a long-term plan strategy that was actually implemented before war began. Based on a whaler and all these things, yes, come in. It's all emergency design. How many? Which is the one you read in books? Heard it many times, then looked up to data construction, all these things. Yeah. Well, guess what? Winston Churchill's, and a lot of people after his publications will tell you it's the former option. That's why it's gone down as the cultural memory. They were war emergency ships. And then you look at it and go, they weren't. They were ordered before the war began. And that is part of the justification of the pause. The idea is put forward, the pause needed to happen so they could build these ships. Not they were already building these ships, so pausing actually caused more trouble than good. Here's the real joke, though. In World War I, they paused capital ship construction and carrier construction. They didn't pause cruiser construction, and they still didn't build escorts till later on in the war. Because the idea the war would be over quickly. And then the new lessons, they'd build better ships. Hello. How can you be sure Hood will be in Full Sea given no matter what she needs? A, she'd be a priority. B, sending her as flagship to the Far East would be Britain's greatest statement of support for the Far East. It would be a massive thing sending her out there. So, yeah. And I don't think she's needed for any Denmark Strait scenario. So she's off being refitted. Plus, I think, and this is, I've got Drax up here, but I don't think you would have a massive modernization. I think she would probably end up going in about January 1941, and probably be out probably July, August 1941. So she would be in 6 months, 7 months. She'd have 6-7 months of modernization. Probably taking place in Scotland. Probably going back to Brown to be done. Maybe Camel Laird's big dry dock in Scotland. Oh god. So, Citizen, I've done a whole video on Japanese naval doctrines. So, for starters, that's not the kind of decisive battle they're looking for. That really isn't the kind of decisive battle. They want a decisive battle close to their shore. They don't want it to be a carrier battle. They want it to be done after a massive amount of attrition. The attrition doctrine is the major doctrine for the Japanese hot decisive battle doctrine. Again, this is a post-war thing put forward by various historians who are transposing and trying to fit Japanese ideas into what I would consider a more strictly Mahanian doctrine, or rather a more traditionalist interpretation of Mahan's doctrine than it actually was. Because you have to remember, Mahan's doctrine is not as strictly focused on battle as sometimes it's put forward. Like Corbett isn't as focused on just operations as a battle as sometimes put forward. They're both actually closer to each other. And I realized there are people, I know someone sent me a link the other day to people on a forum who were discussing me and calling me a Corbettist. I do love how that apparently was and it is a way of putting someone down in their mind. I'm not really sure. I wouldn't fit into Corbett because I disagree with him on certain points, and I disagree with Mahan on other points. Honestly, in the words of my own professor from King's College London when I did my PhD, Clarke's not a Corbettist. He's not a Mahanist, or rather, he's not. I wouldn't say he said I'm not a follower. He's not a follower of Corbett. He's not a follower of Mahan. He's not even a follower of Cable or Gorshkov. He's Clarke. I tend to draw what I think is sensible from each of their theories and put them together, and I tend to work it out because I spend a lot of more of my time in conventional deterrence and how you deter conflict, which does make me sometimes sound like Corbett, but also a bit like Gorshkov and a lot like Cable. And I usually find people who've only read Corbett and Mahan will say it must be Corbett because I sound closer to him than I do Mahan. But people who've read Cable will say I sound closer to Cable than Corbett. And people who've read Gorshkov will say I sound like as much like Gorshkov as I do like Cable when I put forward my ideas. So usually, yeah. It's a fun thing. But the point is, the IJN do not just have we're going for a decisive battle. They have an attrition then decisive battle. If they are sending the Keto Batai down to attack the British, rather than having the forces come to them, they are trying to do an offensive operation to gain territory. That's what you might get in the South China Sea. There is also just an equal chance that the Japanese withdraw and wait for the Allies to push to them, so the Allies to build up their force and push into them, which works against them. Because then you have Implacable, you have Indefatigable, you have all these other carriers from British coming online, you have all the American carriers able to gather, you have a full force being able to gather, and it might well be that the British persuade the Americans that what we'll do is we'll recapture the Philippines, then Hong Kong, then Wei, so we'll secure logistics bases all the way up to as close to Japan as we can get, and then from there we'll launch our attack on Japan. Because that was the British policy. The British policy was to get close to Japan and do a blockade. Oh, good Lord, no, not Fisher. Among Dan, Dr. Dan. Definitely not Fisher. Okay, now, Knight's quoting my good friend Foxo, which basically is, so according to Foxo, apparently Hood was going to get an extra 60,000 shaft horsepower in our engine replacement. I think Foxo has done the maths and has put in the new boilers being fitted in and how much space to take up, and reckoning it could have got an extra 60,000 shaft horsepower of it. If you've put in new turbines and you've strengthened the hull, you could do it. Honestly, you could. You could also go for the existing amount of horsepower, or maybe a slight increase of horsepower, and then use the extra space freed up to put in more subdivision in the engine spaces and give it more survivability. There are options for how that design works out. I think, honestly, they probably want to keep it to roughly 34 knots. Hey, sorry, are you saying you are perhaps boring but competent? Yes, I am boring but competent. That's what I try for. That is my aim, boring but competent. And someday the BBC party will rise. Engines that powerful? Honestly, if you consider the way the shaft horsepower of the boilers and the efficiency of the boilers have grown since Hood's boilers were built, yeah, getting the new boilers would be really to provide that level of efficiency. McLegend, if Hood actually gets a modernization refits and Lions are already in service, do they even need to build Vanguard? Yeah, potentially they don't. Potentially it's the Lions coming to service. And interesting enough, that means you potentially get the two Lions being kept in service post-World War II, and King George V and everyone else dropping out. And that might actually make it more likely one survives long enough to be in the Falklands War or something like that. Because if you've got two vessels in reserve to feed off each other, then you can to an extent cannibalize one to keep the other going. So that could be it. And also, with them having 16-inch guns, they share something with the Iowas, and all sorts of fun things could take place. Could this lead to a situation where Japan only fights the United States? No. Because as I said before, for both Britain and America, the scenario of Japan fighting one or the other, if they're not involved and the other one humbles Japan, which was both, each other's assessment was whichever one ended up fighting Japan solo would win because of their infrastructure differential and their force structure differential.
then they can't. That would displace their position in the Far East, so they can't afford for that to happen. They can't afford for the other one to win, the other one to win solo. So whatever happens, you end up fighting both. Knight put this question in a lot, didn't they? Simon, remaking the war shorter. The more interesting question is the balance of power between UK and US when the war ends. That could be interesting. I think if the war is shorter, if the British have won more victories, and especially if they won things like North Africa on their own and things like that, which they could have done with the logistic shortage of the attack of the Axis force in North Africa, especially if they don't, the Africa Corps doesn't get deployed as well, then there is a bit of a different scenario of the flow of the conflict and its discussions. And if the big battle against Japan is a joint battle, then and sea battle, that's going to be another difference in the whole convoy operations. It'd be interesting to see how that historiography would play out, because I could still see America rising up as the superpower post World War II, but it could be a different scenario. It could be, I'm not sure if the world would be quite as evenly divided, or if it would take a while to divide, and how things would be formed up. Black Horse. If there are British carriers in the Pacific War, in the Pacific earlier with the US, would damage control practices be shared between them? Oh, more than likely. But also, you have quite different ships. You have some quite big differences between the British and the Americans in design, in terms of brought about by a similar problem of the treaties and trying to get what they wanted out of the treaties. That's why it's so interesting that as I said, if you want to see what the British carriers look like when they're not worried about the treaties, you look at the Implacables and the Midways, and Implacables and Maltas, and it's for the Americans, you look at the Midways, and you go, these are what they build if they want to, if they really want it. Let's put it this way. Celeste's Operation Pike might happen in this scenario, but it's going to depend on what you have. Again, as said, if Crete is in any way doesn't fall and is able to be turned into a forward air base, then, as I've done with videos before, if you're bombing the Caucasus from Crete, it's very much in range, and your heavy bombers can really do it. Hello, yes, I know you want to be patted, but you're down there, and I'm trying to talk to here. So if I lean down here the whole time, I look like I'm slightly weird or doing something strange. So I know you want to be patted, and I know you're whacking me with your tail, and I do love you. You're a very cool poodle, but at certain points, you're knee-deep. So calm down. Have a snooze. Yeah, it's the fun history, but it's a bit of history, really. But yeah, Operation Pike, it depends. If they keep Crete, I think it's more likely to have something like that's happened. MC Legend 13, how does this affect the preservation of ships? The Royal Navy decisively beat the Germans, Italians, and the Japanese. Can it mean maybe at least one ship potentially gets preserved in the museum? You never know. The interesting thing is going to be if Warspite's involved in all the operations. If Warspite was involved in Taranto, and somehow involved in the Atlantic battle somehow, maybe some of the Queen Elizabeths get called in for that, rather than left in the Mediterranean to maybe deal with the legacy of the Italian capital ships. And if she ends up somehow being in the Far East as well for that operation, then I could see her getting preserved. We'll never know. You never know. Black Horse, it seems like this is similar to the scuttling or non-scuttling of the German High Seas Fleet. I'm not really... If you're talking about the video, which I did about it, there could be, some similarity. So how much does the lack of pools affect iron carrier procurement? Because the British FRF Wildcats don't appear until 1942. A lot more full miles. In the nicest way, in this scenario, there's going to be enough full miles ordered that there's going to be no ability to draw a design team off them and ignore them. So the full miles probably get an upgrade as well.
and that will also have an impact on things. So full Mars get an upgrade and get more work done on them. You know, I've already answered that one. Raven, does the Audacious class get built, or do we skip to the Malta class? Probably the Audacious get built. They're in between design. But we might actually be... The Maltas might be well under production by the end of this at this point. Especially if... It's going to depend on the light fleets. And if the light fleets don't get... If the light fleets don't get as much focus on them, then there's more going to be done on the full fleet carriers. On the Malta, things like the Audacious and Maltas. Prince of Tonga, with no atomic bombs used in the shorter Pacific War. The 1950s or early 1960s war with the Soviet Union becomes way more likely than Putin. How scared are the Soviets of the Allied navies? Let's put it this way. If this happens, then the reasons for the Soviets to build actually capital ships and carriers grows. Because suddenly they're looking at what the British have done with their force and they're really emphasizing building them. Also, if the war ends earlier, that's going to affect the Soviet ability to produce them. And it's going to mean they're going to have peacetime construction efforts for a year longer under Stalin's leadership. So you might end up with the Soviets actually having things like the Sovietsky Soyuz enter service. In which case, life gets interesting. In this case, life gets interesting and all sorts of different pieces of history can happen. So it's worthwhile considering it, but yeah, it's fun. It's fun. Okay, why am I getting set WhatsApp messages? Excuse me a second. Sisters are fun. Now, I will be live on Discord this evening for questions. I'll take another, let's say, 10 minutes of questions. And then I'm going to go check on what my sister has just messaged me about. Could you worry? Because apparently there's a sort of storm due at 2 a.m. tonight. Raven, there needs to be a question mark in front of the Q&A. MC Leonard, if all 6 lions are complete in this scenario, would there possibly be 2 lion class survive long enough for the Falklands War? Yes. And if so, would Argentina even try to do what they did historically? It's going to depend on other things. Let's be honest, if the Maltas get built and finished off, and they're the ones which are kept in peacetime, and there's no victorious rebuild, and none of that cost and waste, then there's going to be a very different carrier force, and that's going to change things quite dramatically, because Maltas would be equivalent to Midway, and that's going to be quite a useful size carrier for quite a long time. Who knows historically how that works out. But if you have Maltas completed and you have all 6 lions, then you probably have Maltas and lions, some lions still around sitting in reserve in Falklands War timeline, and that could be all sorts of fun history. If Warspite was at Toronto, how do you stop it from deciding on showing the base? Warspite was at Toronto. Warspite was part of the covering force at Toronto. She just wasn't taken close enough. She would have, on some of the plans, she would have been taken closer. And let's be honest, this is another thing I didn't add in. There is the very real scenario that with those number of carriers and with that force structure, Cunningham might decide to risk getting closer and actually going in for a bombardment with the battleships, in which case even the Gileo Cesare might be destroyed. Because if that's the other scenario, you bring those battleships close enough, you can shell that harbour. They know where the ships are quite well. They have a lot of photo evidence. If they've launched the attack and they've put in 3 waves of aircraft rather than 2 waves, 3 waves of 28 aircraft have hit, then they're having fun. They're pushing in further. And potentially you do get the battleships bombarding Taranto, and then that adds to the damage. Volunteer per order O'Sullivan. How many more battleships would the Royal Navy have needed to feel comfortable doing the Catherine conversions? Honestly, a lot more than they had. Because if you're going to do that scenario and you're going to send 3 battleships, basically you're going to write battleships off the board, then you need the Queen, and then you need all the 5 King George V's coming to us, but you also need the Lions coming along and everything. So, yeah, they're not going to do that. Not in that timeline. Churchill had many bright ideas. Operation Catherine was not his greatest one. Ravens, would the Kremlin get built in response to the Iwas and Lions? Potentially. The thing is, if you have battleships coming into service, and if you have Lions, and then you have the Soviets still building battleships, then suddenly there's a reason for battleships to be in service post-World War II, and that means they probably hang around for longer as a more viable force, because, as we've talked about before, there are 2 things that mitigate against carrier operations. Aircraft viability at sinking a target, and weather. Because you can fire a gun from a battleship in a lot more weather states than you can launch aircraft from an aircraft carrier, even to this day. Okay? Even to this day. And so while your enemy still has that threat, that potential capability, you need to be able to manage that capability. And usually how you manage it with carriers in terms of weather states is you avoid those weather areas, which you can do as long as you see them coming in enough in advance. Would this mean that Trouble-class ships would not lose as many battles as they did? Historically, they lost most of their battles before 1942, so they're probably still losing them. It's going to depend on Crete. They also lost a stern in Crete. With that all being said, and all being discussed, I'm going to do that. Hopefully that has done it and things. And then I'll be pop off. I'll be on Discord from about, let's say, give me half an hour. So let's say 10:45 I'll be on Discord. And what else we got coming up? Well, we have got tomorrow is going to be building the fleet. The USN goes full force stacker. And next week it's going to be Interwar Royal Navy harnessing innate aggression for destroyer forces. Also, we've got coming up on Saturday, it's Cheetamus Maximus, naval treaties assuming a philosophy of bending, not breaking the rules, and fitted for, but not with. That's going to be a fun video on Saturday. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all the questions. And as ever, hope to see you all again soon. Hope to see you for brew ships on Sunday. And just thank you for being here. Also, again, with this book, less than £3 in the UK store for the paperback. Yes, the Kindle's even cheaper, but the paperback is less than £3, and you get an actual book to hold. It's worth it. Take care, everyone. Thank you to Twitch, thank you to YouTube, and thank you to everyone for being here. Toodles. And please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. And happy birthday again to MC Legend 13. There's a lot of birthdays around this time of year, so happy birthday to everyone whose birthday is booed. I hope I said happy birthday to all the people who mentioned in the chat when they did. Take care.